Hey everyone, welcome back to our channel. So this is part 2 of Build Your Own Redux. In this part, we are going to take a look at the CreateStore API. We'll see how it works under the hood and how can we implement this functionality on our own. So let's get started. So let's take a look at the code now. First, in this code, we'll take a look at the Redux and APIs it offers. We'll see what is the behavior of those APIs so that we'll have a frame of reference when we implement that in our code. We will try to achieve the same behavior. So right now we take out the structure create store from Redux. We have a reducer called videos, which is nothing more than just a simple function which has a in the state will have a data key which is an empty array. Whenever it encounters a case where action type is add video, then we'll add the payload to our list of items. And if no case matches, then we return the state. That's all. Now, this is the initial state that we have a data key with the what's once array and one item in it. Now, we use the create store to create a store variable. Uh, this create the function signature of create store is that it takes a reducer root reducer which is called with the state and action, preloaded state and enhancer. So we as of now we are not going to talk about enhancer. We'll discuss it more when we look at the topic of middleware system in Redux. Preloaded state is basically, you can say, a simple JavaScript object which the data with which you want to seed your store with. It can be any data from local storage or maybe from server or any previous user session you have saved or anything of that sort. As of now, in this initial state, we pass this data where we have this data key and a single entry in the array. So this store variable, the store which we get from CreateStore, the output of this provides us a function called getState and subscribe, these two functions. So getState is used to check the value of the store, the current value, and using subscribe, we pass a callback, and this callback will always be triggered whenever we make a change to our store. So if I run this as of now, so this is the initial call. That means that when we created the store, we passed the initial data, and now we do store.getState initial call. So this is the data which we seeded with. Now, as you can see, the this is not printed because we never made any change to our store. We just seeded some data, and this function will always be called and when we trigger any modification. So let's do that. We'll use the next function exposed by store, which is dispatch, as discussed in the previous video also. That whenever we want to update our store, we dispatch an action. This is doing the same where type is add video and this is the payload. And let's console log this also. So now if I run this, so let's follow from here. So same as before, that we make the initial call. This is the data which we seeded. Then in the second call, we pass this data which was added to our store and our listener was called. Similarly, if we pass another action and we check the state after that, so let's clean this. So let's follow from here. So this is the initial data. This is the output of the second dispatch. Listener was called, and the third time another dispatch, we dispatched in another action that was added to our list of items, and listener was called. So this is the behavior which we are going to replicate in this video. We'll see create store, and create store will return an object store which we are currently storing in store variable. It will have three methods: get state, subscribe, and dispatch. So let's start by importing this create store from our custom Redux. So we'll do require custom Redux index. We'll do create store here. Now we'll go to the index.js of custom Redux. Here we'll get the create store from its respective file. We'll do create store, then we'll return it, basically export it, create store. Now if I go to create store, we'll create this function, create store. We'll create the basic blueprint of it first. We'll return it. So as we have seen before that whatever is we from the output, when we call the create store, we get an object. Basically, we get an object which has three functions, which is get state, we have subscribe, and we have dispatch. So this is the output which we get. So let's implement the same. So from this function call, we'll have get state, we'll have subscribe, and we will have dispatch. Now let's define these. We have get state, we have subscribe, and then we have dispatch. So this so far so good. Let's run this code and see if we did something wrong. So I think there would be yeah, so there would be no output because whatever the parameters we are getting, we are not using them, and the get state as of now returns nothing. But let's just add the parameters, arguments, basically reducer and the initial state, or we can also call it preloaded state. So let's take a look at the getState function for now. So basically it is going to return a variable state, which is the current state of our store. Let's define this variable. So let state, and as we have seen that whatever value we pass in the preloaded state or the initial state, we might call it, that our store is seeded with that. So we add it here, and whenever someone calls or invokes getState, then we return this variable. So if I go here and if I run this, so what happens here is that we create the store, we get these methods, we call store.getState, and we get now we have the initial data which we seeded our store with. So let's take a look at the subscribe function now. As discussed before, this function takes a argument, a callback, which we are going to call listener, and this callback is invoked whenever an action is dispatched. So basically it is used to watch store changes, and listeners are invoked whenever an action is dispatched. So now multiple, we can subscribe multiple callbacks, multiple functions, multiple listeners, so we have to store these listeners somewhere. So let's create some sort of data structure, and we'll create an array for this listeners, and we'll push these. So whatever callback we get, we push it into the listener array, and now this subscribe function returns a function which is we are going to call unsubscribe, which is basically we can use this returned method to unsubscribe the callback which we just subscribed. So how can we do that? We'll find the index of the current subscribed method. So index of listener, then from listeners we just simply splice it, index and one. So that's all. So now when we in this when we call this, so there would be no change as such because no store modification triggered. That's why this lister was not called. There was no, but if we in this we add a console log called, and this is the unsubscribe, and we also console log unsubscribe, or maybe we can do type of unsubscribe. Let's run this. See, so this subscribe method was called, and the callback was subscribed. It was pushed into the listeners array, and that's why we see the called here, which we were console logging here. And the output of the store.subscribe is a function. And when we do type of unsubscribe, so that is the function. And if we call unsubscribe, if we invoke here, then this listener will be removed from the listeners array. So let's do a bit of cleanup and add some validation. So let's remove this console log, and we'll also remove this console log. But now here, the listener should be of type function, then only we would be able to call it. So just before this, let's add a validation that if type of listener is not equal to function, then we'll throw a new error, and we are going to call store listeners should be of type function. So if we test this out, let's remove this, copy, comment out. Let's just do this much. Okay, so we pass this test to. So now if I run this node index, so we got the get state, but when the subscribe method was called, then the error was thrown. Store listeners should be of type function. And if we remove this and use the previous one, and this is the error which we got, store listener should be of type function. If we remove this and we call, everything works. So now let's implement the dispatch function. So like we have seen before, it is used to trigger store changes, basically dispatch actions. This takes an input parameter, which is the action. And so basically what happens is, let's discuss the behavior first. Whenever we get an action, let's say the action is type add video, and we have some payload. Okay, now this action is passed to every part of our state. Let's say our global state is, we have a key videos where we have some videos data into it. Then we have users and some data related to users. Now every key, videos, users, we have a corresponding reducer function for it. Videos, we have users, you might want to call it anything, I'm just more calling it videos and users. So what happens is that whenever we get an action to inside as a parameter here, then this action along with the current state is passed to every reducer, and each reducer computes that part of our global store. And we override this users with the output of users reducer, and the summation of all these reducer function is our final global state or store. But I'm just interchangingly using store and state here. So if we have add video, then videos uh, reducer will be called, and we'll have videos where this key type for the first argument would be state. This reducer will be called where first argument would be state and second argument would be our action, and then the payload. And just like this we'll have okay, just like this we'll have users, and we'll pass the same thing here. Would be payload, and the output of these reducer functions will replace these videos and users, and the entire thing would be our store. So that means that we will uh, pass this to all the reducers. So let's state would be reducer. So this is the root reducer. The input we get is the root reducer. That means this is a function which takes state and action, and it inside this function we have uh, let's say videos or users, videos and users, and these are respective reducers, and they are called with the same argument which we are passing. So to this root reducer we will pass the state and the action, and the output of this root reducer will replace our state. And as we have seen that whenever we initiate a store change, then all the listeners are called. So all the listeners will iterate over the listeners. For each listener we'll have the listener, and we will just simply invoke the listener, and this dispatch function returns the action which we pass it to. Okay, so let's see this. We did that. Store reducer. So if we go back here and we uncomment this, and then we console log this also. Now if we run this node index, see, so this was our initial call. This was our the data we initially passed. Now in the second call we initiate a dispatch and we provide the action where type is add video, and this is the payload. So our videos reducer is called, and this is the payload which it got, and it adds the second item to our list of items. And since we initiated a store change, our listener was also called. So now let's take a look at the validations which we can add here. So the first thing is that action should always be an object. So but if it is not, then we'll throw an error. So if type of action is not equal to object, then we'll throw a new error where we are going to say that an action should be a plain object. So if we test this out, that here in place of dispatch, let's say we pass a function, and we pass a function and we run this, then we'll have the error. Then this error is thrown, and action should be a plain object. So let's revert this. So this behavior is true in Redux also, that if we uh, use the original Redux and we pass a function in the dispatch and we clear it and run this, then actions must be plain objects. Use custom middleware for async actions. So that is the same behavior we are trying to replicate. The validation checks that always the action which we dispatch should be a plain object. And if we run this, it works. So let's bring back our CreateStore. Now the second check is that an action should always have a type and a keyword type, and it should not be undefined. So if type of action dot type is equal to undefined, then we'll throw a new error which is called action should have a type. So if we have to test this out, let's say we give undefined here, and we run this. Okay, undefined action dot type is equal to undefined. So yeah. Okay, we haven't saved it. Yeah, action should have a type, and if we check the Redux for this, actions may not have an undefined type property, and the same have you misspelled a constant. So we are just keeping the messages simple, that's all, but the behavior is same, that action should have a type which is should not be undefined. So that is done. So now let's see what else validation we can add. So now we have this reducer. Well, like discussed before, that this is a root reducer, which is basically a function. So we are not checking it anywhere as of now. So at the very start, what we can do is that if type of reducer is not equal to function, then we'll throw a new error saying reducer must be a function. And if we do this, where let's say in place of root reducers, we send an object, empty object, and we run this. So reducer must be an object. So let's recap what we did here, what validations we added. So we started out with that action which we are dispatching of should be of type object, and the key in action object should not be undefined. If it is, then in both the cases we'll throw an error. Also, to compute the new state, we'll call the root reducer function, and root reducer should be a function, as I just mentioned. So if it is not, then we'll throw an error. So let's take a look at one of the behaviors of Redux, which is related to whenever we dispatch an action. So I'll show you that here we create the store, we call the getState. Let's comment out this for now. Let's unscribe. What we do is that we'll just dispatch an action here, and after that dispatch we'll call the getState. But while doing so, the changes what I made here is that rather than importing the videos, I just wrote the videos reducer here only, and uh, I am using the CreateStore from original Redux package. Now what I did was that before returning the new state, I just did store.getState. I am checking what is the state value here in the reducer. So if I run this now, so now you can see the error is you may not call store.getState while the reducer is executing. The reducer has already received the state as an argument, pass it down from the top reducer instead of reading it from the store. So what does that mean? So this means, so the error here means is that we in this reducer we already have the state variable. So we have to use that state variable in our reducer or any reducer, subsequent reducer we call. We cannot in any reducer we can never call while an action is being dispatched. We can never call store dot get state, or let's say we can never subscribe a function here. Let's say if I call subscribe and if I run this, then again you may not call store dot subscribe while the reducer is executing. So that means that whenever we dispatch an action, and that action is currently in process, as in the computation of the state is in process, then inside that reducer we can not use any uh, store API. We cannot subscribe. This is no. We cannot do a get store. We cannot dispatch, because if let's say if we are already in process of dispatching an action, then we again dispatch, then it might lead to an infinite cycle sort of a thing. Like you're from the reducer, you dispatch, then again the reducer is called, then dispatch, then reducer dispatch. So the cycle keeps on repeating. Also, if you have any subscribed function, then you can even not unsubscribe from it. subscribe permit. Inside a reducer, you cannot do any of these things. So let's see how can we implement this behavior in our code. So we remove this. We call the Redux store from our own code. Now, when we are dispatching a function, then we cannot call. Okay, this is getState. So we cannot call getState. So how would we get to know that we are dispatching a function? Obviously from here. So let's call it is dispatching to true. Let's set it here. We'll define it first. Let dispatch equals to false, and this is being set as true. Now in the get state, we'll return the state, but we'll also add the check that if is dispatching, then throw new error saying cannot call store.getState while dispatching. Okay, so we cannot do that. So this is done. Now the second one is that we cannot dispatch, we cannot subscribe, we cannot not unsubscribe. So the same, we can copy this and we can put this in our, let's first take care of subscribe. So if we are in process of dispatching an action, that means is dispatching is happening, then we cannot call subscribe. And similarly, if we are in dispatching, then we cannot even unsubscribe. So we cannot call this. Okay, this is done. So now let's go back to our dispatch. So here we are setting it true, but we haven't set it to false. So this will forever block this. So let's do one thing. Let's put this entire thing in a catch and try catch, and in finally what we do is we'll set is dispatching equal to false. So when this is happening, when the entire process happens, or whenever if we encounter any error, then we will uh, set it false. But let's do one thing also. We saw here that whenever dispatch in the reducer, we even cannot call dispatch. So we haven't taken care of that. So we copied this, we put it here. So let's say an action is already in dispatch state, so we cannot call dispatch again from the reducer. Let's move this out, and we will, let's try this again. This is now so as of now there would be no error because we are not doing anything, we are not doing any illegal operation here. So but if we do store dot get state, and now if I run this, then we'll have the error cannot call store.getStale while dispatching. Similarly, anything if we subscribe or if we dispatch, then cannot call subscribe or unsubscribe, nothing works. So let's just recap what we did. Whenever we are in process of dispatching an action, so in the reducer function, we cannot access any store APIs. We cannot do a get state call. We cannot subscribe to new functions, and if we have already subscribed any listener, then we cannot unsubscribe. And if we are in process of dispatching, then we cannot dispatch another function from that reducer. And finally, when our state is in fully updated, or if we encounter any error, then in that case we will set the dispatch to false. So let's take a look at another behavior. So the changes what I did here is that just like we had the videos reducer here, videos reducer, I created another reducer called users, which has add user, and this we will just add the user to our list. Okay. And what I also did was that from Redux official package, we are taking out combined reducers. So let's not worry about the functionality here as of now for combined reducers. Basically, it will take all the reducers, individual reducers, and return a single function, which will take the state and action and pass on to individual reducers. So in place of our videos, we are passing the root reducer, and the we updated the initial state where we are just passing videos as of now with the data. This is the initial state. So now if I run this and we'll see, then after our initial call, this is the seed data which we sent, and this is the data after we added one another video, our second dispatch. But if we check and if we do a console log in the user reducer call, and we run this, that means that our user reducer was called, but in our state, when we do initial state, we do store.getState, we never got the data. So our the default this default state, we never got this data. So ideally, and if we check this the same behavior in our Redux, and we remove this, and so see, in the initial call we have the users data, the default, we are pre-populating the initial call. So how can we fix this? So we remove this from here. So what happens in Redux is that whenever we create a store, whenever we make a call to create store, then before returning this final object, uh, you know, uh, a default action is triggered. Where type, and we call it init action. So a default action is triggered whenever we come. This happens when we do this. Okay, where it is? Yeah, whenever we do a create store call, whenever we create the store for the first time, then a default action is triggered, and this action where type is init action is passed to every reducer, be it videos or users in our case. And since we are not taking care of this action, so default state is returned, and that and our the store the very first time will get the default data from every reducer. So if I run this now, see, we have the same data as the when we uh, when we got from the original Redux package, the same data we have now. So this brings end to our video. First, we looked at CreateStore from Redux, its behavior and all the methods exposed by it. Then we tried to implement the same behavior in our code. We intentionally skipped some parts of CreateStore because those are as of now out of scope for our process or our library. Um, and this code which we wrote in our video, this is more than enough and will withstand its ground in any interview setting. So if you like this video, then do subscribe. If you felt that I missed out somewhere or something can be done better, then do share your feedback, and please do share with other folks so that we can raise awareness around this content. Okay, thank you. Have a nice day. Bye bye.